To chat more about Biden's speech last night and his legacy, we're joined by Thomas Schwartz, historian and political scientist at Vanderbilt University and biographer of Henry Kissinger, Lyndon B. Johnson, and John J. Mccloy. Thanks for joining us, Thomas.
Well, thank you for having me on the program.
I just want to start by getting your first thoughts on Biden's speech last night.
Well, I was not terribly impressed. I thought it was rather flat. It was more similar to a State of the Union address in highlighting his accomplishments than in really talking about why he had suddenly decided not to run for re-election. I thought it could have used some humor. When he was interviewed by George Stephanopoulos shortly after the debate, he said that the only way he'd pull out is if God Almighty had come and told him that. I think he should have said something about having a vision or something like that to lighten the mood in that why he had decided not to run again. As it is, it also struck me he slurred his speech several times. He didn't look very good, and he has a stare now that looks very vacant. And in that sense, I didn't find it terribly reassuring. I think obviously the words were certainly designed to elicit an emotional response, talking about telling the truth to Americans, talking about putting aside his own personal ambition for the unity of the country. But I thought it left me a bit flat.
How do you think this address will impact Biden's last 6 months in office, as this isn't quite goodbye for him yet?
That's right. I mean, he is a lame duck. He will really be able to do relatively little domestically. Obviously, foreign policy is still the president's concern, and there are some major foreign policy issues out there. So this is something people are going to be watching, the possibility of a ceasefire in the Middle East, the issues with Ukraine, China. So I think in that sense, we'll be watching more of the foreign policy issues rather than the domestic issues to see how Biden performs in the last 6 months of his presidency.
Biden again showed his support for Harris, but didn't add anything new. Do you see this address impacting her campaign for president?
That's right, but I don't think it matters. I think she's had a tremendous start for her campaign. And I think Democrats are so relieved that Biden's not running that they've been enthusiastically embracing Harris. She's had no opposition to becoming the nominee. And so I think this speech really did very little either harm or help for her.
How will Biden's legacy be remembered, and will it be impacted by the ups and downs of his brief run for re-election?
I think I'm not sure that historians will really think a lot about this. Biden initially thought and said during the 2020 campaign that he saw himself as a transitional candidate. In the last 2 years or after the midterms, he decided he was going to run again. And I think he was a beneficiary of a rather very sympathetic media and the willingness of many of his aides to hide some of the problems he was having. I don't think this will be as critical in looking at his legacy. I think people will focus more on what has actually happened during his presidency. But I think if Harris loses, this might be seen more negatively, because I think then it will be seen that he did not allow the Democratic Party to really have a sufficient contest that would have put up a stronger nominee against Donald Trump. I think he'll be seen as having followed a very chaotic period in our history. It's hard to say because, of course, if Donald Trump wins and has another 4 years, that's going to affect also how people see this period and what Trump accomplished or didn't accomplish. I think Biden's legacy would be very greatly helped if Kamala Harris wins. Then he'll be seen as having been a transition to a younger Democratic Party leadership. So I think to a certain extent, his legacy is going to be somewhat controversial, depending on, you might say, what follows it and what types of actions are taken by presidents subsequent to him.
Thanks so much for joining us, Thomas.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on the program.